Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, I'm here with Matt Brown. Matt is a technology consultant and software developer from Cambridge, New Zealand, which is quite different than Cambridge in the UK, I suspect. This year, he launched his own business with a vision to solve real problems in the world using software systems. Prior to starting his own business, Matt spent 15 years as an SRE at Google, where he was first an individual contributor working on Google's internal corporate infrastructure and external DNS infrastructure, before transitioning into leadership to build the European half of the SRE team responsible for Google's entire front-end networking stack. After returning to New Zealand in 2016, he led the creation of a new globally distributed team called Customer Reliability Engineering, which worked with Google's largest cloud customers to deliver reliable cloud services and help their adoption of SRE practices. In addition to his primary roles, Matt also served as an incident commander, which is something we talked about recently, and responder for Google's technical incident response team, helping to coordinate and resolve major cross-service and company-wide incidents. He has a strong interest in the process of how we learn effectively from incidents. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Matt. It's not often we get people from who've worked at Google and have seen SRE at the source. So anything else I missed in your intro?
No, it was pretty comprehensive. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and looking forward to the conversation.
Today we're going to cover a few different topics. First of all, sort of set the scene about on-call and what it's all about. Then talk about some of the logistics and practicalities of on-call. Then best practices, and finish up by wrapping up. So I'm going to start with the dumb question, because that's kind of like my role a lot of the time, is to be the person who asks the dumb question that everyone else wants to ask but doesn't. What is on-call and why do we need it?
We need it because we build complex systems that don't tend to always work as we want them to. Or one way to look at it is that, like a complex system is always in some state of failure. And so there's actions that often need to be taken in a timely manner. And so given that reality, given the world of complex software systems, there's sort of two approaches to it, unplanned or planned. And in my experience, and I think in a lot of people's experience, it's a lot smoother if you put a bit of pre-planning into how you're going to deal with surprises and unexpected occurrences in the world. And so on-call is, I think, the collective term that we as an industry have sort of arrived at for the idea of typically a rotation, a way of sharing that load or sharing that burden. And I think it is a burden. Nobody really has a lot of love for on-call. It's often a little bit of a stressful role. But I hope some of what we can talk about today is a number of ways and things that you can use to try and lower that burden and lower the sort of inherent stress that occurs when you're responding to these surprises.
I really like what you said at the very start, how complex technology systems are always in some state of failure. I've never really heard it put like that before, but that is exactly how I think we should be thinking about software systems, as opposed to, I think secretly many of us think we can build the system which will be completely, failure-free, perfectly reliable, but that's just not possible. And I think it's getting harder and harder over time. Would you agree, or am I stretching there?
I cannot remember where I picked it up from, but it's a fairly widely stated belief. Somewhere in the learning from incidents community is where I will have picked that up from, and it just rang true for me as well. Like when you work with these complex systems, there's not really a normal, there's not really a steady state. Somebody is responding to something, even if it's not under an on-call, like emergency type situation, there'll be a rollout happening, there'll be a deploy happening, or numerous examples that you could pick from, but the system is dynamic. And now, sorry, you asked me a more specific question that I've just forgotten about while talking about the joys of complex systems.
No, I think you kind of answered. I was asking, do you think that the complexity of systems is increasing over time, and therefore the chances of having a completely fault-free system is impossible already, but it's getting even more impossible over time? Or am I imagining that it's getting harder?
I mean, I agree with both of those things, but separately. I think, yes, the complexity of the systems is unfortunately increasing, even when we, intentionally try and build less complex systems. just more being done with software and more usage. And so there does seem to be an inevitable trend towards more complexity. And I think that, we are dealing with more incidents, but I think that sort of dynamic nature of the system happens very early in the evolution of a complex system. So you've got to start dealing with that dynamism and dealing with that lack of a steady state, even at very low levels of complexity. And I think it's a bit of a paradigm shift, like, it's a change in mindset in thinking about how you reason about a complex system. But once you've made that shift, I think it serves you well, regardless of where you are on that complexity scale.
When you were an individual contributor at Google, or when you were managing teams of people who were doing on call, what kind of specific activities were people doing?
Yeah. So, answering the question first, and there's a little bit of a disclaimer I want to give as well about on call. But on call typically tends to be break fix. So you'll have monitoring systems, or sometimes it'll be another human who's noticed something wrong. But there's some signal that some aspect is not behaving as expected, and so you'll receive a notification, or colloquially we often call it a page. And so that triggers a process of, break fix, diagnosis, triage, getting the problem, the fault out of the system from a user perspective. Like we'd often talk about trying to mitigate the issue first before actually finding the trigger and resolving that trigger. So a team will have a set of, ideally, what we'd call like generic mitigations, or something you could do to redirect the traffic, redirect the requests away from a service that's having problems to another instance of it. Might be a classic example of that. And so I think that's the sort of bread and butter, or the fundamental work that we think about when we think about on-call. But there's a lot of other aspects that we could bring into the conversation as well, in terms of learning from past incidents, following up retrospectives, postmortems, working on action items or takeaways that we have written down as a result of those reviews. And then perhaps even more broadly, looking at the system, just becoming familiar with how the system works, or investigating, maybe a week ago, you noticed something unusual in the system. You didn't have time to look at it then, but now, during some time when you're scheduled for on-call, maybe you've got a chance to do a bit of a deep dive and understand some of those dynamics of the system. So I think all of those things can be wrapped up in what on-call is.
I was going to ask about that, whether there is any time for sort of experimentation or exploring data just to see what's going on and how I can understand it better. I remember as a performance tester, there were some times when I would have a bit of extra time to take a deeper look at some results, for example, and I'd find a bunch of things, system behaviors that no one had noticed before. I hadn't noticed before. And sort of, is that a kind of thing that an SRE might do, or you've heard of happen in the past?
I think it is a lovely thing. Like it's great if you can find the time and if you can make the time to do that. I wanted to make a disclaimer, and so I think I'm going to make that disclaimer and then come back. We're on an SRE podcast and we're talking about on call, and I think it's very easy for us to sort of equate the two things together. And like on call is an SRE responsibility, or SRE exists to handle on call. And I quite strongly believe that on-call is something that is and should be relevant to every software team, regardless of where that software team sits on the DevOps SRE spectrum, regardless if you're an SRE team paired with a development team or you're just a development team. Comes back to that, we're building complex software systems. There's going to be surprises, and we're going to have to handle them one way or another. So I think it's important for all of us to talk about on-call, because if we don't plan and if we don't execute on-call well, I think it can have really negative effects on the culture and the happiness on the individuals in the team. And so that's why I'm quite passionate about seeing on-call done well. And I think SRE as a center of specialization or a center of expertise is a place where we can develop some of those best practices, not a term that I hugely like, but perhaps develop some of those behaviors and cultures that we can then use with any sort of software team, regardless of whether you identify as an SRE team or not.
I don't know how you feel about it, but I've heard some people talk about SRE not so much as a role, but more as a mindset and a culture and sort of ideas and practices and concepts. I kind of buy into that. I don't think you need the title SRE to be improving operational work and making things more reliable. And isn't that the goal of it all anyway?
Absolutely. I actually have a half-written blog post which I hope to publish soon about sort of my philosophy on SRE, or how I sort of reconcile myself to the endless debates about, what is SRE, what is DevOps, what's platform ops, how do they all relate together. I think SRE is sort of four things. It's a set of principles which lead into some practices. If you do those practices enough, then it can start to become a job role. If your organization has the flexibility to actually let you specialize on that, then you can start to have a job role. And then if you have enough people, if you have enough size and scale, for that role to then expand to multiple people, then you can start having teams, organizations, and industry discussions about SRE. And so four different levels of practice. And, even if you are a software developer, you can practice those principles. And an SLO is a great example of an SRE practice that you can use even if you are not an SRE by job title or on an SRE team, and hopefully you will get some value from that.
I can't wait for you to finish that blog post. It sounds like
I can't either.
Yeah, so I was curious because one of my weaknesses in the world of SRE is that I haven't actually really been on call much / at all. I've been involved in it loosely from a performance engineer perspective and a little bit of SRE, but not so much. So I was curious about your experiences of any particularly sort of interesting or eventful or maybe stressful on-call experiences that you had over the years.
Many, almost too many to remember. One that's very prominent to me is I was looking after Google's DNS systems, and I broke internal DNS resolution for Google production, essentially globally, and it was only by luck that the rollout that caused that happened to not go to 2 clusters, which allowed us to easily roll back the problem. If it had gone to those last 2 clusters, then we were sort of in a black start, bringing back from everything being down scenario, which, and this was 10 or 11 years ago, had not been practiced. And, that's a terrifying place to be. So that's definitely a memorable experience. And things are a lot better now. There was a lot of learning and work that went into preventing the particular configuration mistake that I made there, but then also how would we come back from that? So I think that's a good example of both something terrifying and memorable, but the value of learning from an incident. On the stressful side, I have enjoyed being on call, and I think part of that comes from having a very supportive on-call culture, which hopefully we can get into talking about shortly. I've actually found the most stress when I've been an incident commander for larger incidents, so not directly on call responsible for fixing, but more responsible for the coordination of a larger group of people. And the stress there, I think, just comes from competing needs from lots of different stakeholders. You've got customers, you've got executives who need updates. Then you've got engineers, who are trying, it's the fog of war. So you're trying to help everybody stay coordinated and trying to get communication flowing freely, while also making enough sense of the problem to say something that is useful and clear to customers. And those are some of the most stressful experiences that I've had when you're trying to bring all of that together under time pressure.
Yeah, I interviewed Andy Thoreau recently about a report he did. I think it was an SRE. It was a few months ago, and one of his findings was the importance of good incident commanders. And I remember asking him, "What? That sounds like the most horrendous role. I would never want to be an incident commander." So I completely relate. I mean, not that I've done it, but it sounds like a really difficult role to fill, even though you're sort of in the middle of everything.
There's a certain amount of enjoyment that I think you can take from it, but it does come down to having the right support structures, having that preparation, having an incident management plan and structure that you can work to. And without any of that, I think the role would absolutely destroy you.
Moving on to sort of the logistics and the practicalities of being on call and running on call. Should on call be dedicated time to being on call, or do you think it's okay to mix it with project work?
I think in an ideal world it's dedicated, but there's considerations there in terms of like the size of the team and the size of the company as to whether that's actually practical. If you're a two-person team, then saying you need to have dedicated on call is probably not a very useful recommendation, and possibly even for teams bigger than that as well. But so I think the size of the team is one consideration. How busy the on-call rotation is, how stable or reliable the services you're supporting are, and what the workload is perhaps the other consideration. Like the more that you are expecting the on-call person to do, the less the expectation of them to be doing any of their normal project work should be. The other way that I would look at this question is also who is on your on-call rotation, and how is it staffed, and what is their experience level. If it's a very sort of small team of very experienced people, then I think you can rely a little bit more on individual discretion or individual experience in how they plan and how they allocate their time. Whereas I'm a big believer that, on call can be spread across a team of people of varying roles and experiences. And so when you have an on call rotation, which has people who are earlier in their career or less experienced with the service, it can be very freeing for them, and it can take away a lot of the stress, or not even stress, but anxiety is perhaps like on call can be anxious even if you're not being paged, because there's that anticipation of what could go wrong, and can I deal with it? And so telling people like, you're on call, during this shift, I don't expect you to get any of your regular project work done. There's something to respond to, then that's your primary responsibility. But outside of that time, use that time to investigate the system, learn about the system, look into some interesting aspect of it, back to what we were talking about before, or do some training, practice one of those mitigations that we talked about. Have those skills, have those actions that you may need to take fresh and exercised in your memory. And I think that can be one part of building a really effective on-call culture, is giving people that time and space.
Speaking about culture, last week we caught up and we were talking about what it is to have a fair on-call schedule. Okay, so what does it mean to have a fair schedule? Like, so you've got a team of people. How do you choose who goes on call and when, and what is equal and what is fair?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I think perhaps starting from the opposite, like what is unfair, is I think the easiest place to start. Unfair is if you have one or two people that all of the load falls on. Even if those one or two people really enjoy on call, like you do get people who are like they respond well to those sort of situations, and then they enjoy the triage and the problem solving. And so they'll often gravitate towards that type of work. But it's never useful in the long run, or it's never healthy for a team if you end up relying on those sort of people. One, like they can burn out over time, even if they do enjoy that work. But secondly, like all of us go through life changes, career changes. And so if you're relying on the efforts of one or two people, to sustain the break fix work on your team, then that's a vulnerable position for the team overall. So I think that's the warning sign that it's unfair, if there's, one, two, or a small number of people who the work is always falling on. Coming back from that though, like fair doesn't mean equal, I think is something that we are a trap that it can be easy to fall into. Like we want on call to be fair across the team, but we all come from different backgrounds, different availabilities, and I guess the implicit assumption here that we haven't called out yet is on call often involves actions outside of your typical 9 to 5 office environment or working hours. And that can place, that's part of when we talk about on-call being a burden, that responsibility to be available and to take action outside of normal working hours is part of that burden. And so I think being sensitive and being aware of differing people on your team having different life responsibilities, maybe ongoing, maybe just during a period of time, if there's a new addition to their family. And so it's unfair to expect the same amount of availability out of working hours of every member of your team. So I think having the ability to be flexible in your schedule, making sure that you're not hotspotting on one or two people on the team, but as long as you're not hotspotting on one or two people of the team, then having a distribution of work that's not equal is ideal.
I've seen the other side of it too, where I've seen people who don't have kids and they feel because they don't have kids, they miss out. In the context of an organization, there might be special leave for people who have kids if the kids get sick and other benefits they don't see.
I think it's also important to, like, this is where a lot sort of rests on the manager or the leader of the team to work with each of the individuals on the team and sort of tailor their responsibilities, whether it's on call, whether it's their project work, to where they're at in their life and their career. There's a difference between sort of making short-term or mid-term accommodations and somebody who doesn't participate in on-call ever. I'm not saying that that's never justified, but that's often slightly trickier to manage from a sort of fairness perspective from a team where everybody is on call, some amount of the time, but how that plays out sort of week to week, month to month, quarter to quarter, you've got flexibility there. The segue that I think this might be useful into those, what's the benefits of on-call? Like I've said a few times on-call is a burden, and I think that is how most people, default to looking at it. But I think there are definite benefits to being on call in terms of what you learn about the system and the experience you gain with the sort of patterns of behavior that these sort of complex systems exhibit that make you a better software engineer and that help you engineer and build more reliable and more performant systems going forward. So I think that is a discussion that I've had with people in the past when they have been, reluctant or nervous about going on call, is to talk through. It's not just a task that we have to do, for the sake of keeping our software online, but there's actually something that we as engineers gain from that process of being up close with how the system is operating day to day.
And what a way to build confidence too. If you can be on call and deal with unknown situations popping up in your face and feel confident to do that, I think that gives you confidence in other areas of your career too. You're like, I can deal with whatever gets thrown at me,
Absolutely. Confidence is a big thing. And I think it comes back to that culture of the team. And, part of what gives you confidence can be, as you said, the ability to deal with unknown situations. But almost by definition, at some point you're going to be stumped. And so a maxim that I like when you're on call, your job is not to fix the problem. Your job is to make sure the problem gets fixed. And there's a subtle difference there in that it's not on you to personally resolve that issue, but you're there to coordinate the fixing of that issue. And so that brings in the option of escalation, calling in more people. And so, you've taken the page, you've taken the alert, you've done some triage, and we can train for triage as a team. We invest some time into understanding our monitoring and how we triage and what the signals that we can look at are. But if that is not making sense, if that's not, suggesting a clear course of action, then ideally we're going to have a culture in the team where it's very easy for you to pull in more resources and pull in more people to start assisting you with what we'd then call an incident. And I think that's a big part of having a healthy on-call rotation.
We've talked a little bit already about scheduling on-call rotations and there's a flexibility required for that. One thing I do want to ask is about, do you think that people should be compensated sort of financially or maybe given extra leave for being on call and for sort of being available outside of normal working hours?
Absolutely. Again, it does come back a little bit to company size and, the amount of time that is expected or the busyness of the on-call rotation. But fundamentally, even if you are not actually having to take actions a lot of the time, you're almost certainly being asked to be available. And so there's probably some, impact on your freedom there. And that should be compensated. I think there's a range of ways to do that. Like it could be written into the job description, and there could be an increment on the base salary that is theoretically there to recognize that part of the role. And I think that's probably the least transparent way to do it, but that would be the baseline expectation that I would have. But I think particularly if you take those, recommendations, or if you've gone down that path of having a very flexible on-call scheduling system, so different members of your team are potentially taking, quite different amounts of on-call load, at least in the short to medium term, then I think it's useful and it's fair to have a compensation system that actually reflects the amount of time that you've been scheduled on call.
Moving on to the sort of area of best practice, let's say you have, okay, I was curious, if you've got a junior engineer who's maybe in their first year of work, would you look to get that person involved in on-call, or is it more for experienced engineers?
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to add them to on-call with no support on their first day or their first week on the job. But absolutely, part of them becoming a member of our team is everybody on the team is on-call. Now, I think how you do that and how you make sure that how you make sure that new engineer is comfortable with that, and that is a source of pride and accomplishment for them in their career rather than a source of anxiety and stress is pretty crucial. So I think there's a bunch of things we can talk about how to do that well, but absolutely, I don't think you have to be senior or know everything to be on call.
And so what is that process? How do you go from this is my first time doing on call as an engineer to I'm comfortable independently being on call?
We've talked about a little bit of it first, which is it starts with the team culture. And so part of that is like we're all on call, we're all sharing this, I was about to say equally or fairly, but it's a responsibility that we spread across the team. And we have a culture of escalation. We have a culture of helping everybody out. And so I think those baseline expectations sort of set the environment that you're working within. I like to have quite a structured training program for new people coming onto the team. I think that's beneficial, regardless of on call. But I like checklists. So, it's a checklist of like, here's the common action. I talked about those generic mitigation actions. So, here's common actions that you would need to take as a member of our team. Or here's the list of systems we run. Here are the architecture diagrams, for all of them. And often we do it as a series of quizzes. So it's not you're already on the team. We're not like, giving you a test to rehire you. But we found that sort of Socratic method of transferring information was quite well. So you'd get some stuff to read. Maybe another person in the team would give you some whiteboard talks on the architecture. And then you would sit down, with a senior member of the team, and we'd have a very conversational, very friendly quiz where I would ask you to, explain the system back to me or draw the system diagram back to me. And I think that's a great way of onboarding people onto the team because it can be very interactive. Like if there's a gap in what we have, told you about the systems to date, then we can very naturally fill it in that conversation. And so you start with that basic level of investing time into teaching new people onto your team about how things work. Then when it comes to actually being on call, we'd do what we call shadows. So you'd be scheduled to sit next to, traditionally when we were in the office, or, at least virtually sit next to the person who's on call, and you would watch them and you would follow along with them as they respond to alerts. And then when you're comfortable, when you've shadowed a few times, then we would switch to a reverse shadow, where now you take the lead in responding to those pages, but you have an experienced member of the team explicitly scheduled to be there with you. So, you've got that instant escalation if you need it. And I think that's I've brought many, new people straight out of university onto on-call rotations that were looking after Google's front-end, infrastructure very successfully. So I think it absolutely is possible. And it can be a pleasant experience for everyone involved.
That is so good to hear, because I've been part of Reddit threads on the SRE subreddit talking about you can't be an SRE unless you've got 10, 15 years of experience. This is ridiculous. It's good to hear that it works at Google. Another question I had about sort of best practices, what makes a good run book? I like the idea of a run book. It sounds like a fantastic thing to have, but how do you do a good one?
Yeah, I come back to checklists. I love checklists. So again, perhaps I'll take the like a bad run book is one that has you executing commands or taking actions without really understanding why you're doing them. Or so you're sort of following a rote list of steps, but you don't have the context or the understanding of why you're doing those steps. And I think if you're just responding and copying and pasting things, that's a bad situation to be in. Where a run book is useful is like we've talked about on call is inherently a little bit stressful, and our brains don't always perform perfectly when we are under stress. And so one of the ways that we can help ourselves is by writing down, like, here's the checklist of things that I want to do when I am on call, when I've just received an alert. And so I think like that is where a run book can come in, really useful. Like this is the service, this is the SLO, or this is, some quick bullet points of how the service operates, like what's critical to the users. And then each of those sort of links out to the SLIs or the key monitoring aspects that tell you, is that user experience being met? And if it's not, then some pointers to, like, here are the key dependencies of that, or here are the key things to check that could be hindering that. And then you can sort of imagine it as a tree, like, for each of those dependencies, if you find a problem with that dependency, what are the potential mitigations? What are the potential actions you could take? Or if it's owned by a different team, if it's an external dependency, like who do you escalate to, who do you contact to? So I think the concept of a run book is something which supplements your knowledge, something which adds to the context that you have for dealing with that incident, rather than something that takes away knowledge and just forces you to follow a series of steps is how I like to think of it.
Given that you're saying it's structured a bit like a tree, wouldn't a document be a bad way to represent that? Are there like tools or sort of visual models that you use to represent run books, or is a document fine?
I think most run books, in my experience, have tended to be document like wiki page, anything that's easy to link between. And I think you end up with the tree structure sort of being implicit in the links. Yeah, I don't think I've seen, the only tooling I've sort of seen around run books was very infrastructural and practical to like host them on sort of separate from the rest of the infrastructure so that, they are reliably available with a very low dependency chain. I've never really seen any tooling around the formatting or the presentation of them. Well, that's an interesting idea. Maybe there is something there.
There you go. Maybe I've been helpful. Okay, moving on to sort of wrapping up, there's a couple of things. We've already talked about sort of the benefits of being on call. But what about, is it hard, do you think, to find people who are willing to be on call?
Anecdotally, I hear that it is, but I think, that comes back to some of what we've discussed. Like on call does tend to inherently be seen as a duty or a task. And I think if you don't invest that effort into planning for on call, planning for how you schedule it, planning for how you handle it, then it can make it a needlessly stressful experience. And I think all of those factors, when you hear of other teams or other companies not doing a great job of it, that can make you very hesitant, to participate in on call as well. I think it doesn't have to be that way. I think, I've experienced a number of teams over my career where on call has been critical to the operation of the company, but still a pleasant and enjoyable. It's not always enjoyable in the moment. Like, if you're getting a pager storm, there's always, some amount of unpleasantness that's involved in that. But if you can get through that and then, be able to look back on it and take satisfaction that together with your colleagues, you were able to restore service and, your users had a good experience because of the actions that you and your team took together. That's a really satisfying feeling in my experience. And so making sure that the on-call rotation is fitting around people's lives and people are well supported to do a good job of on-call. If you can get those things right, then I've never had a challenge staffing an on-call rotation when those things are in place. But if you don't invest in those, then absolutely, I think like I would run away from a team where that wasn't something that was being prioritized.
And the last question is, how can organizations make on-call more enjoyable for engineers to be involved in?
So I think it comes back to that investment that we have talked a little bit about, like doing the planning up front, investing in a culture where you are supportive. There's a number of ways that you can build and train people that we haven't talked about yet. In Google, we called them wheels of misfortune, sort of role-playing exercises, or I think a lot of people call them sort of game days. There's a lot of activities you can invest in, which help build that culture and help prepare the team for on-call well. But what often holds back investment in those things is there's so much other work to do. Like, we're trying to get products out the door. We've got a huge feature backlog. Reliability feels like a nice to have, or investing in reliability feels like a nice to have that we just can't afford right now. Yeah, so I think if you can get away from that mindset of seeing investment in on-call as a cost and seeing it as you're investing in the overall culture and the overall ability of your team to deliver software, reliable software at a decent velocity, then that's something that we can all aim for.
Thank you so much, Matt, for coming on the show. It's honestly, it's a pleasure to talk to someone who's worked in the SRE for so long and in such a illustrious situation. Matt is currently doing research into on-call tooling. If you're willing to chat to Matt about your experiences at on-call and with the tooling that supports on-call work, there will be links to connect with Matt and have a catch up with him underneath this podcast. So reach out to Matt if you're willing to have a chat. He's a good person to talk to. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Please do reach out. And thanks, Stephen. It's been a wonderful chat. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks everyone for tuning into another episode of Slight Reliability. Hope you all have a good week, and I will see you all next time.